On Thursday, October 18th, 2001, Amy St. Laurent stood in front of her clothes closet in the small Maine town of South Berwick. She had a big meeting coming up the next week at work, and she wanted to pick out just the right outfit. Amy was an attractive 25-year-old woman with strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes who wanted to become a model. She'd even gotten some professional photos done. But when it came to her job at Pratt & Whitney, which was an aircraft engine assembly plant, she wanted to be taken seriously. And that meant dressing professionally so that people didn't get the wrong idea from her looks and youth. But as Amy tried and rejected one outfit after another, she knew that the real reason she was making such a big deal out of this was to distract herself. She was trying to avoid thinking about the man who was coming to visit her that night from Florida. Amy had recently broken up with her boyfriend after living together on and off for 5 years. She wanted to get married and have kids, but she realized that her ex, Richard Sparrow, was just not the one. She liked to travel and go to museums, and the longer she'd been with Richard, the more she realized he was just a homebody who didn't care much about any of those things. She felt like breaking up with him was the right decision, but it was still hard. But now that she had broken up with him, she was able to rediscover the joy of being single. And a few weeks ago, she'd taken a trip to Florida, and she had met a handsome 27-year-old man named Eric Rubright, who had taken her out on his motorcycle. He'd even tried to kiss her, although Amy had politely declined. Ultimately, Amy had a lot of fun with Eric, and so when Eric asked if it was possible for him to travel to Maine to visit her, she said yes. But Amy was not interested in a romantic relationship again, and she didn't want to lead Eric on. So she made it absolutely clear to him that when he visited in Maine, nothing romantic could happen between them, and he would have to sleep in the spare room. Eric said he was totally fine with that, but just in case, Amy had another safeguard planned for this visit that she didn't mention to Eric. Her ex-boyfriend, Richard, had offered to come over and hang out with them as a buffer, like a third wheel. And now, standing in her bedroom, thinking about how potentially awkward this three-way dynamic was going to be, Amy hoped she did not make a mistake in either inviting Eric or inviting Richard. That evening, Eric arrived at Amy's apartment, and right away, things got off to a bumpy start. Despite what he said, Eric did not seem thrilled about sleeping in the spare bedroom. And he was clearly annoyed that Amy's ex-boyfriend Richard was just at the house with them. And then on Friday, which was the second day of Eric's visit, Amy and Eric got into a little fight. By Saturday, October 20th, so the third day of Eric's visit, Amy was just tired of Eric's constant grumpiness and disappointment. She'd been very clear with him that she did not want a romance, so Amy decided that for the rest of the time Eric was visiting, she would just go out and do the things that she thought they both would enjoy, and you know what, if Eric didn't like it, then so be it. So Amy took Eric to Boston to go to the Museum of Fine Arts, which was one of Amy's favorite places, and then afterwards, they went out for a nice dinner. And Amy noticed Eric seemed to be having a much better time now. So as they were driving back towards Maine, Amy asked Eric if he was up for stopping in downtown Portland, which is a city in Maine. But as soon as Eric said yes, Amy immediately began worrying that she was underdressed for a big night out on the town. She was wearing jeans, sneakers, and a sweatshirt with their company's logo on it. She considered going home to change first, but at the same time, she didn't want to dress too provocatively and give Eric the wrong message, so she decided she would just go as is. Downtown Portland is a really popular spot, especially at night. And so when Eric and Amy got there, all the restaurants and bars that lined the cobblestone streets were packed, and mostly with young people. Amy suggested they stop at a sports bar, and Eric seemed interested. But as soon as they went inside, Eric began acting all disappointed again. Amy wanted to play a game of pool, like billiards, but Eric didn't. So Amy, determined not to have a terrible night, just went and found a couple of 20-something-year-old men named Russ and Cush who she could play with. And the three of them would play and they would talk and laugh, while Eric just kind of awkwardly stood by, drinking a beer and looking bored. After a while, though, Amy started worrying that she was being rude to Eric. So she took him to get some pizza, and even paid for his slices herself. Then she asked if he wanted to go to a cool club called the Pavilion that was partly inside an old bank vault. Amy hoped that the Pavilion would impress Eric, but as soon as they walked in, he got that annoying bored look on his face again, and he immediately said he didn't want to dance. And at this point, Amy was just kind of over Eric, and so she left Eric standing in line for drinks while she headed for the dance floor all on her own. On Sunday afternoon, so the following day, Amy's mother, Diane Jenkins, drummed her fingers on her laptop inside of her South Portland home, trying to burn off some nervous energy. She was getting concerned about her daughter. Amy had called her mother around 10 p.m. the night before, and Diane could tell from the sound of Amy's voice that she was in good spirits. Amy had said that she and her friend Eric were driving downtown, and so she asked her mom if she wanted to join them for a drink, since she lived pretty close. But Diane was already in her pajamas, so she said no. But after that, Amy had not called again, which was odd because the mother and daughter talked every day. Diane picked up the phone again and called her daughter's cell phone, but it went to voicemail for the fourth straight time. Diane wanted to think that Amy was just busy with her weekend guest Eric, but it had been hours and hours, and Amy never ignored her calls for this long. So Diane picked up her phone again, but this time she called her ex-husband, who was Amy's father. He lived close to Amy and took care of her cat whenever Amy was away for more than a few hours. But when Amy's dad picked up, he told Diane that he hadn't heard from their daughter either. And so Diane really started to worry that something could be wrong. The next morning, when still Amy had not called her mom, Diane called Amy's work. But the person who answered the phone call said Amy hadn't shown up, and she hadn't called ahead or emailed ahead to tell anyone why she was not coming into work. At this point, Diane felt a full-blown panic attack coming on as it dawned on her that her daughter truly had disappeared. And so Diane hung up on that call and then immediately called the police to report her daughter missing. That evening, which was October 22, 2001, Detective Danny Young flopped onto the sofa and flipped on Monday Night Football. It was the veteran detective's first night off since the 9/11 terror attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. For the past 6 weeks, Young had been investigating crimes by day for the Portland Police Department, and then by night, he and his bomb-detecting dog had been doing extra patrols, checking out the Portland Ferry for explosives, or checking out suspicious packages. And so at this moment, the detective's living room couch never felt so good. So when his phone rang a few minutes later, Detective Young wasn't sure if he even wanted to answer it. But he slowly did get off the couch and he picked up, and on the other line was a deputy sheriff from the county who said he needed Detective Young's help. He told Detective Young that the daughter of one of his friends was missing after she had spent the evening with a guy from out of town. The sheriff told Young that the woman's name was Amy St. Laurent, and her mother had already filed a missing person report in Portland, and her family had already gone out and begun putting up missing person posters all over the place. But police had not launched a full-scale investigation yet because Amy was an adult and she had not been gone for very long. But this deputy was wondering if maybe Detective Young could help off the books. Detective Young wanted to say no because he was exhausted, but Amy's disappearance felt oddly personal to him. He had a daughter who was not only Amy's age, but shared the same name. And like Amy St. Laurent, Young's daughter also loved going to the Pavilion nightclub. As the deputy sheriff told Young more about Amy and why her family was so worried, Young's gut told him something was wrong here. So he told the deputy he would look into this. After the call with the deputy sheriff ended, Detective Young called a supervisor to tell him he was going to investigate this Amy St. Laurent case. But the supervisor thought this was a bad idea, that it was a waste of time. A 25-year-old woman disappearing after a night of partying was not exactly big news. Maybe she had a hangover, or maybe she met up with a guy and didn't want to come home quite yet. Ultimately, the supervisor felt like the chances that something bad had happened to Amy were pretty slim. Also, the supervisor pointed out that this was Detective Young's first night off in a really long time, and he needed to take a break. But Young was adamant that he wanted to do this, and so after some convincing, his supervisor let him launch his own unofficial investigation. Before Detective Young left his house, he called a sergeant at the police station. Since Amy's friend, who she was with the night she disappeared, Eric Rubright, was from out of town, there was a good chance he had rented a car. So Detective Young wanted the sergeant to call the local rental agencies and see if any of them had a record of Eric renting a vehicle from them. And sure enough, the sergeant quickly called Young back. Not only did the sergeant know that Eric rented a maroon GMC Envoy, but she also had another important piece of information. The car Eric rented was equipped with a GPS tracker, which meant the rental company knew the vehicle's exact location in downtown Portland. Detective Young immediately sent some officers to stake out the rental car, and within an hour, Eric showed up right around 10:30 p.m., and strangely, he wasn't surprised to see the police officers at all. He told them he'd already seen the missing person posters that Amy's family were putting up all over Portland, and he said he was concerned about Amy too. And so the officers would take Eric back to the police station to ask him some questions. By the time Detective Young got to the interrogation room late that night, his fatigue from 6 straight weeks of work had disappeared. For the detective, it was like flipping a switch. The second he launched an investigation, it was the only thing he cared about, and he could focus like a laser beam no matter how tired he was. Eric was already sitting in the interrogation room, and the detective quickly sized him up. The first thing he noticed was how big Eric was. Eric had played semi-professional rugby, and Young thought how easy it would be for him to overpower someone Amy's size. But the second thing Young noticed was that Eric seemed agitated, like someone who was afraid he was in trouble. And as Detective Young peppered Eric with questions, Eric's story began to sound pretty odd. He claimed that on the night Amy was missing, they were at the Pavilion Club, and then after the last call, which was sometime between 12:45 and 1 a.m., Eric went to the bathroom. But he got stuck in a long line, and then by the time he got out of the bathroom, Amy had taken off, leaving him alone. So he got in his car and he circled the block once to see if he could find her, but when Amy didn't turn up, he decided that she would just have to find her own way home, and he left. But what made this story so hard to believe was that according to Eric, Amy had left her wallet, cell phone, purse, and car keys in his car. Detective Young was about to ask Eric to explain this when someone knocked on the door. Young frowned, but he knew nobody would interrupt unless it was really important, so he excused himself and stepped out of the room. And once he had, an officer handed him a phone, and when Young put it to his ear, he heard his sergeant's voice. The sergeant said he was with 3 young men who had flagged down his patrol car to tell him they were with Amy the night she disappeared and they needed to talk to police right now. Detective Young told the sergeant to bring them in right away. But Detective Young had to get back to his interview with Eric, so he assigned other detectives to talk to the 3 young men and just report back to him. The 3 young men eventually arrived at the police station, and they introduced themselves to the detectives. They were Russ Gorman, Kush Sharma, and their other roommate. And obviously Russ and Kush were the 2 young men that Amy had played pool with on the night she went missing. And they would tell the detectives that recently a bartender had showed them the missing person poster of Amy, and they instantly recognized her as the woman they had played pool with, and so as soon as they saw it, they left the bar and flagged down the first patrol car they saw. Russ was a charming guy who had very stylized hair. He had frosted tips, which meant the ends of his hair, kind of all throughout his hair, were bleached blonde, and he gelled his hair up. And although he'd only been in Portland for 18 months, he was already a regular in the bar scene there. And he would tell the detective that he and his buddy Kush had been playing pool when Amy had come over and asked to join their game. And Russ would say that actually he and Amy hit it off right away, and he actually asked for her phone number. But Russ made it clear he did not expect this to go anywhere, because he watched as Amy literally went back to her date, and so Russ and Kush just left and went to another bar. But then the 2 men went to the Pavilion nightclub, where sure enough, they ran into Amy again. This was around the time that Amy had gone to the dance floor on her own. She saw Russ and Kush, and the 3 of them basically started dancing together. And so Russ would tell the detectives that the 3 of them just danced all night, and then after last call, Russ said he wanted to keep partying, so he invited Amy to come back to their apartment. He told her they were going to have an after-hours birthday party for their 3rd roommate, and he wanted Amy to join them. And so she agreed, and they all got to the apartment at around 1:15 a.m. But the birthday party never really materialized, and Russ could tell Amy was really bored, and so eventually he just asked Amy if she wanted a ride back home. And Amy actually said that she wanted a ride back to the Pavilion because then she could go find her date, Eric, and he could give her a ride home. And if for some reason she couldn't find him, her mom's house was right nearby and she could just walk there. So at about 2 a.m., Russ dropped off Amy right outside the Pavilion on the curb, and then after watching her head towards the Pavilion, Russ just drove home and stayed there for the rest of the night. And when detectives spoke to the other 2 roommates, they would tell basically the exact same version of the story. The detectives were excited. It sounded like Russ may have been the last person to see Amy alive, and so they rushed to tell Detective Young what they had learned. Detective Young was still talking to Eric when the detectives knocked again on their door, and when Young stepped out and they told him what Russ and the roommate said, a new theory popped up in Detective Young's head. He wondered if maybe Eric saw Amy get dropped off by some other guy, and maybe that sent him into a jealous rage. But when Detective Young walked back into the interview room and sat down, he said nothing to Eric about what he had just learned. Instead, he asked Eric to go over all of his actions after Amy had left the club without him. Young wanted to see if he could maybe catch Eric in a lie. Eric claimed that after he realized Amy was gone, he just drove himself back to Amy's house and then let himself inside using Amy's key. But when he didn't find Amy inside, he said he felt weird about staying in her house all alone, so he slept outside in his car. The next morning, Eric said he left his car and went back inside of Amy's house to use her shower and also to drop off all her belongings she had left in his car. And then afterwards, he said he did leave an angry note pinned to her apartment door, and then he left her coat outside right on the hood of her car, and he dropped her keys onto one of her tires. And that was the end of his weekend. When Eric stopped talking, Detective Young couldn't help but feel like this guy's story just seemed totally off. And soon he would have yet another interruption that would confirm his suspicion. Suddenly, another detective called Young out of the interview room to tell him that Amy's neighbor had called her local police department on Sunday with her own concerns about Amy's safety. She'd seen Amy's expensive coat on the ground beside her car on Sunday morning, so she had knocked on Amy's door to see if she was okay. But it wasn't just the coat that made the neighbors nervous. On Friday night, the neighbor had seen Eric angrily peeling out of Amy's driveway, and when the neighbor actually asked Amy what was going on, Amy said Eric was furious with her because Amy didn't want to have sex with him. So when this neighbor saw the coat on Sunday morning, and then she knocked on Amy's door and Amy didn't answer, this neighbor went and got Amy's keys from the landlord, and when she went inside and realized it was empty, she called the police. Detective Young had never in his life had so many witnesses volunteer to help out on a case, and every single witness story really seemed to point the finger at Eric. And it was easy to imagine Eric being mad after driving all the way to Maine from Florida only to be rejected, and the neighbor's story was especially damning for Eric, because it meant that Eric was already enraged that Amy wouldn't sleep with him the day before Amy had left him for two other guys at the pavilion. And Detective Young thought Eric's story about driving to Amy's house and sleeping in his car on a night when the weather was in the low 40s, so nearly freezing outside, was nonsense. But when Young went back in to question Eric about all of this, Eric did something very unexpected. He said he had proof that he drove to Amy's apartment late on the night she disappeared. Then he pulled out a receipt from a gas station, which was located on the way to Amy's apartment. And Eric told Detective Young that if this receipt wasn't enough, he also had a witness. On his drive to Amy's, he had to pass through a toll, but he didn't have any money. And the toll taker had basically taken pity on him and let him through anyway, and so as a result of that, Eric was confident she would remember him. By now, Detective Young's head was spinning. This was the most chaotic interview he had ever conducted. Usually, investigators had to hunt for tips, but tonight they were pouring in too fast for him to even keep up with. The detective felt like Eric really was his best suspect, but Russ had been the last person to see Amy alive, so he couldn't be ruled out yet. But this actually wasn't even the biggest question that Detective Young faced, because Amy's disappearance actually wasn't officially a criminal case at all. Amy was an adult, and she'd only been gone for 2 days. Her friends and family were obviously worried, but as of now, there was no evidence that any crime had even been committed. Amy might actually be just fine. Some of the other detectives thought Detective Young was kind of overreacting. They thought Amy was going to waltz in any minute, wondering what all the fuss was about. The next morning, so 3 days after Amy disappeared, police went to her apartment to go look around. They found the key to her apartment sitting on the tire of her car, exactly the way Eric had described. But when they found Eric's angry note he had left inside, they discovered that it was much nastier than Eric had said it was. In the letter, Eric asked Amy very angrily where she'd gone, with a choice curse word thrown in. It was very clear Eric must have left feeling very mad, chucking Amy's coat as he left. When they searched Amy's apartment, the police took her computer, her mail, her answering machine, and even her diary. And as they flipped through the pages of her diary, they found pages of Amy's deepest thoughts, her struggles, her fears, and her hopes. But there was one name that kept coming up over and over again in this diary. It was Amy's ex, Richard Sparrow. In fact, she'd started this diary the day after she had broken up with him. So that day, the police picked Richard up at his house, they drove him to the station, and they put him in the same interrogation room where Detective Young had just questioned Eric the night before. And when Richard told the detective that he had slept over at Amy's place on the first night that Eric was visiting, Young felt his heart start to race. It was hard to imagine a more awkward or potentially explosive arrangement than having an ex-boyfriend sleeping on the couch while Amy's new man slept in the guest room. It was the type of situation where you could understand one or both of these men getting really mad. But Richard would tell Detective Young that truly he was on friendly terms with Amy and that he had only stayed in her apartment on Friday as a favor to her after she begged him to. And also, on the night that Amy disappeared, Richard said he went out in South Berwick with friends and then went home, an account that Richard's roommates all confirmed, which meant he was very likely many miles away from Portland when Amy went missing. So this interview with Richard really had Detective Young turn his sights back towards Eric and Russ, the two men who were chasing Amy on the night she vanished. As the days went by with no word on the whereabouts of their daughter, Amy's parents became increasingly desperate. On Thursday, October 25th, almost a week after Amy disappeared, her mother Diane went to the media and offered a $35,000 reward for information that would lead to Amy's safe return. And by now, Amy's case was no longer an off-the-books investigation by Detective Young. This was now a full-scale police operation. As a reminder to himself of just what was at stake, Detective Young put a photo of Amy on his desk. By now, Detective Young was pretty sure he knew which one was responsible for Amy's disappearance, but he couldn't prove it. So for now, he was just going to treat Eric and Russ like equal suspects. When Young had checked both men's backgrounds, he'd found they both had criminal records. Russ was on probation for theft, and the night he gave Amy a ride, he was driving with a suspended license, and facing the prospect of having his license revoked entirely. Eric had some minor drug offenses on his record, but more alarming was his ex-girlfriend in Florida had a restraining order against him. Weirdly, her name was also Amy, and she even kind of looked like Amy St. Laurent. Police had begun a much more aggressive search for Amy. Sheriff's deputies retraced Eric's route from the nightclub back to Amy's apartment, checking anywhere that somebody might be able to hide a body, but they found nothing. Police in surrounding communities looked through abandoned buildings, and they searched the train tracks and highways and the edges of the harbor. National Guard helicopters searched from above, and detectives even spent their own time looking for Amy on weekends. But no one could find any trace of Amy. Meanwhile, both primary suspects left town. Eric went back to Florida where he lived and worked, while Russ went to Alabama since he had family there. Usually, Detective Young would want to keep his suspects close, but in this case, he was actually happy that both men had left. He figured the killer might relax once he was away from Portland, and maybe he might confess something to somebody close to him. 5 weeks later, there was still no sign of Amy, and everyone at this point feared she was dead. Officers who had initially been skeptical that Amy was even in trouble were now drawn into the case out of real concern for the young woman. They'd learned so much about Amy during the investigation, not just the details of the last few days before she vanished, but the details of her life, how kind she was and how spontaneously generous. One couple told police that Amy gave them money out of her savings one Christmas when they didn't have money to buy presents for their kid. Another friend told police that Amy one time had paid for a plane ticket so the friend could fly home to celebrate her parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Amy even took a leave of absence from work to stay at a friend's bedside when they were in a coma in the hospital. Some of the officers began referring to Amy as, quote, our Amy, almost like they were her father. Detective Young found himself constantly looking at that photo of Amy he kept on his desk, and whenever he looked at her, he felt like she was looking back at him, pleading with him to help her. And as time dragged on without any breakthrough, people in Portland began getting scared that a killer was literally on the loose among them. And you gotta remember that this was around the time right after 9/11, so Americans at this time were very much on edge. And now Amy's disappearance had only made the paranoia much worse for people in Portland. As the lead detective in the hunt for Amy, Detective Young felt like, so far, he was letting the public down, especially her family. But he didn't really know what else to do. Without a body, he had no crime scene and no evidence, and so he was totally stalled. And that's when Detective Young got an unusual offer. A lieutenant from the Maine Warden Service named Pat Dorian thought he might be able to help find Amy. Every year, Dorian and his team found over 300 lost hikers, mostly people who got turned around inside of Maine's vast forests. Even though they'd never looked for a dead body before, the lieutenant thought the wardens might be able to apply their expertise to this case. Detective Young wasn't sure that a bunch of game wardens could help, but winter was coming, and once there was snow on the ground, finding a body would be much more difficult, if not impossible. So Detective Young told the lieutenant that yes, he would like his help. So on Monday, December 3rd, which was 6 weeks after Amy had vanished, Detective Young squeezed into a crowded conference room at the police station and took a seat at the conference table. Detective Young's team sat on one side and Lieutenant Dorian's on the other, all of them looking over a table full of equipment, computers, and mapping programs. Detective Young began by showing the wardens all the places the police had already searched. But Dorian really wanted to know more about the suspects, so his team could get a better sense of where either man might go to dispose of a body. So Dorian asked questions like, how familiar were they with the woods and the outdoors? And were they the kind of people who would feel comfortable hiking into an unfamiliar area? Detective Young decided he would just focus on the one suspect he was pretty sure was responsible for Amy's disappearance, which by this point he fully expected was a murder. It was a gamble what he was doing, but in his experience, Young had seen that the more focused a search is, the better the results. So for hours, the people at this table, Dorian, Young, their teams, discussed every detail of the case, and about the one suspect that he was focusing on. But a question from the wardens caught the detectives by surprise. Did their suspect have access to a shovel? And surprisingly, despite all their interviews and questions, none of the detectives had any idea. So immediately after the meeting, Detective Young asked other investigators to find out whether the suspect had a shovel. And right away, word came back that the suspect did have a shovel, and in fact, he had borrowed this shovel recently. 5 days later, at 6:30 a.m. on December 8, 2001, a new, massive search for Amy began. 100 officers and 45 Maine search and rescue volunteers fanned out across southern Maine, along with cadaver dogs that are trained to smell dead bodies. But after hours of searching, the team found nothing. The cadaver dogs indicated that they smelled something a few times, but it turned out to just be nothing but dead animals. Then, around 1 p.m., searchers turned down a side road off the highway that had been used to haul gravel to expand the road. At the end were trails that led off into the brush and some debris from the construction. With snow closing in, the searchers spread out in a line shoulder to shoulder and marched into the woods just as they had at other potential burial spots. And after about 30 minutes of this, one of the searchers ducked under a branch and they came upon a spot where the earth seemed to have been pressed down and kind of smoothed over. So the searchers brought over the dogs, and right away the dogs were barking and pointing at that spot on the ground. Searchers immediately yelled out for Detective Young to come over, and when he did come over and he looked down at the spot, he could see there were some pine needles that had been thrown over this area, almost like to disguise it, and so it seemed very likely this was a burial spot. And sure enough, when searchers got their shovels and began digging in that spot, they would uncover Amy's badly decomposed body. The next day, Sunday, December 9th, the medical examiner conducted Amy's autopsy. And from this autopsy, it was clear that Amy had been beaten and shot. But there wasn't much other physical evidence to go on. There were no fingerprints or DNA from the killer on the body. In fact, her body was so decomposed that the medical examiner needed Amy's dental records just to confirm it was really her. 5 days later, on Friday, December 14th, Amy's family held a memorial for her at a funeral home in South Portland. 25 white candles surrounded a photo of Amy, one for every year of her life. Beside the memorial sat a bouquet of pink roses, just like the flowers that her father would give her every year for her birthday. Detective Young would have loved to be at Amy's service, but he couldn't go because at that very moment, he was in his car driving south on his way to pick up the killer. Even though the killer had left the state, detectives had kept a close eye on him. And when Amy's body was found, they finally got their break, because the killer had believed police would never find the body, and so when they did, the killer panicked. He called someone and he confessed to the crime. Finally, all the pieces fell together, and for the first time, Detective Young knew what really happened to Amy. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 21st, the killer asked Amy if she wanted a ride home. At least that's what he told her he was going to do, because in reality, the killer had other plans in mind. When Amy got in the car, the killer kept staring at her. He thought she was absolutely stunning, and he was sure that if he could just make the right move, something might happen romantically between them. So he turned on the radio, found a good song, and began to drive. Eventually, the killer got onto the highway, at which point Amy told him he was going the wrong way. The killer told her that he was just going to take her for a moonlit walk. It was going to be great. But Amy said she had no interest in that and just wanted to be taken home. But the killer wasn't prepared to do that. So he pulled off the highway to a secluded spot, and he turned to Amy and said, "Please, just give me a chance." Then he told her how pretty she was and how attracted he was to her, hoping this might make her want to stay out longer with him, but it only made her more agitated, and she eventually demanded to be taken home right now. And at first, the killer did begin driving back on the highway as if he was going to take her home, but then he turned down a side road, at which point Amy began screaming at him to turn around and bring me home right now. The killer could feel anger boiling up inside of him to the point where he just couldn't control it anymore. So he pulled the car over on the side of the road, he put it in park, and then he turned and just wound up and punched Amy. Stunned, Amy leapt out of the car and just began running. But the killer had more than just fists to hurt Amy with. He grabbed a gun from under the seat and then ran out after her. And when he caught up to her, he couldn't contain his anger. He hit her again across the face with the gun, splitting her lip and chipping her tooth. Then he hit her for a third time, this time hard enough to break a bone in her face. Amy tried to fight back, but her killer was much stronger, and he knocked her to the ground and pinned her down. They struggled for a while, and at some point the killer tore at Amy's clothes and sexually assaulted her, and then when he was done, he grabbed his gun again. He knew if he were to let Amy go, he'd get in big trouble. So instead, he put that gun to the right side of Amy's head, and he pulled the trigger. The killer knew he needed to hide the body now, but he knew he couldn't do much in the dark, so he dragged her body into the nearby forest where she was out of sight, and then he left her for the night. And then the next day, he returned with a shovel, and he buried her. Even before Amy's body was found, Detective Young had already begun to suspect one person much more than anybody else. Detectives actually managed to find surveillance video of Eric at a gas station alone at 1:36 a.m. on the night Amy went missing, just as Eric had claimed. They also found the turnpike toll taker who remembered taking pity on Eric when he couldn't pay the toll. And so with all that corroboration, police didn't think it was possible for Eric to have returned to Portland to pick up Amy by 2 a.m., the time Russ said he had dropped her off. But police had a harder time verifying Russ's claim that he had driven Amy from his apartment to the Portland nightclub and then returned home in just 25 minutes. Russ's roommates had vouched for him, but their stories didn't hold up. His roommate claimed he knew Russ came in around 2:25 a.m. because he was in the middle of writing an email to his aunt when Russ walked in. But when police looked through his emails, there was no record that he actually sent any email to his aunt. And police could not find a single person who actually saw Russ drop off Amy at the pavilion. Instead, police found evidence that Russ was lying. He got pulled over by police on the night that Amy went missing at around 3:14 a.m. for not dimming his high beam lights. So clearly he hadn't come home quickly and then stayed home like he had claimed, because here he was out and about at 3:14. Then, after Amy disappeared, police found that Russ had borrowed a shovel from his mom's boyfriend, and the location of her body where she was buried, it was found less than 4/10 of a mile from Russ's mother's house. And in addition to all that evidence, Russ actually just confessed the entire crime to his mother after news broke that Amy's body had been found. On Monday, June 30th, 2003, Russ Gorman was convicted of killing Amy and sentenced to 60 years in prison. 21-year-old Debbie Carter looked around at the Tuesday night crowd in the Coachlight nightclub where she worked part-time as a waitress. All her tables were taken care of, and the rush of after-work customers had ended at least an hour ago. Grateful for what looked like it would be an extended lull in business, Debbie leaned against the bar, already looking forward to the end of her shift when she could finally get off her feet. As though reading Debbie's mind, Debbie's high school friend and Coach Light regular, Gina Vieta, caught Debbie's attention from across the room, where Gina and some friends were sitting at a table pushed up against the far side of the metal building. As soon as their eyes met, Gina raised her beer bottle in Debbie's direction and then pointed at the seat next to her before mouthing, "Come join us." Debbie gave her old high school friend a big smile, then she checked with the bartender to see if he had any more drinks that she needed to serve. And when he shook his head no, Debbie turned around and then tracked down her boss to see if she could officially go off the clock to go hang out with Gina and their friends. Like the bartender, Debbie's boss didn't have anything for her to do, and so he quickly smiled and said, "Go have fun." Not only was Debbie hardworking, but she was also popular with customers, and she was good at handling any unwanted attention or advances in a way that was direct but not confrontational. So Debbie's boss, who couldn't ask for a better employee, was glad to give Debbie a little break. As Debbie grabbed a beer and walked over to join her friends, the bouncer made a mental note to make sure that Debbie got safely to her car when the coach light closed later that night. And that, in a nutshell, was the town of Ada, Oklahoma. It was a tight-knit community. People knew each other, and people looked out for each other, and a lot of people in town didn't even bother to lock their doors, at least when they left their houses during the day. As for the coach light, on that night, December 7th, 1982, the popular local watering hole was a perfect example of how the town as a whole had held on to those deep-rooted small-town values despite the huge social and economic changes of the last 8 decades. Gone were the oil gushers and the huge deposits of petroleum and natural gas that had put Oklahoma on the map back in the early 1900s. And while Ada was still home to some small oil rigs that were still operating, most of the rigs in and around the town were rusted and derelict. Since the 1950s, when Oklahoma started emptying out more oil and gas reserves than it was discovering, the town of 15,000 residents had mostly turned from oil to other industries that paid by the hour, like work on pecan farms and in factories and feed mills. But as the county seat of Pontotoc County and one of the larger towns in rural southeast Oklahoma, Ada was still busy. People were no longer making overnight fortunes on oil, but the town was known nationally for horse breeding and for top-of-the-line horse sales that drew customers from all over the country. Ada's courthouse and jail, as well as the town's lawyers and police force, were also busy. They had plenty to do trying to keep up with the ravages caused by the local methamphetamine drug epidemic that had hit so many towns in rural Oklahoma. But even in the face of these changes, Ada was holding its own. A lot of local businesses had moved to the edges of the town, but Main Street was still doing okay. There were no boarded-up storefronts, and neighbors and coworkers gathered for lunch in cafes and sandwich shops. The town was also home to East Central University, whose 4,000 students, a lot of them commuters, helped boost the local economy and bring a little diversity to Ada's mostly white and mostly Christian population. And places like the Coach Light, with its cheap beer, along with food that was more filling than it was fancy, did very well, especially on weekends when it was filled with a mix of factory workers, 20-somethings, and a dance and party crowd who went there for the live music and the big dance floor. On her way over to Gina's table, Debbie had to slow down a couple of times to say hi to a few of the regulars. Even though it wasn't a busy night, there were more than a dozen people at the Coach Light who knew Debbie by name or who had gone to school with her. And noticing that she had stepped away from work, a few of the men decided then and there to see if they could get Debbie out on the dance floor before closing time. Because Debbie was one of those very easy-to-like people. It wasn't just that she was attractive and athletic, standing 5 feet 7 inches tall before pulling on her work boots. She also had an open smile and friendly dark eyes that matched the color of her glossy shoulder-length dark brown hair. In addition to her part-time job at the Coach Light, Debbie babysat, she worked part-time at the local glass plant, and she served food at a local drugstore lunch counter. As a child and teenager, Debbie had never been a huge fan of academics, and her father, Charlie Carter, still liked to tell the story about how Debbie, on her second ever day of going to school, had looked up at her parents and asked, "You mean I've really got to go through with this?" So instead of going on to college after graduating from Ada High School in 1979, Debbie had put all her energy into saving money to buy her own car and rent an apartment of her own. It was a goal that meant she had sometimes clashed with her mom, Peggy Stillwell, who felt that Debbie was spending too much time at places like the Coach Light and drinking too many beers with old high school buddies like Gina. But 2 months ago, Debbie's dream of living on her own, a big girl life, as her family called it, had come true. That's when Debbie had packed her belongings into the 1975 Oldsmobile car she had bought with her own money and moved into her very own 3-room apartment above a garage at 1022 East 8th Street, right next to the campus of East Central University. Once Debbie's mom was satisfied that Debbie had chosen what seemed like a safe location to live alone, Peggy had given her blessing to Debbie, and mom and daughter were right back to being as close as they had always been. And that closeness was true of Debbie's relationship with her father, too. Even though Debbie's parents had divorced 5 years ago, both Peggy and Charlie shared a bond of unconditional love for Debbie and her 2 younger sisters. And since Charlie sometimes picked up a shift as a bouncer at the Coach Light, he was able to keep a protective eye on his daughter without being intrusive. Now, slipping into the seat at the Coach Light next to Gina and a group of their other old high school friends, Debbie stretched out her long legs under the table and sighed with contentment. It had been a long day, and just sitting down was a relief. But even as Debbie exchanged greetings with her friends, her mind drifted to her new home. And just thinking about the apartment she had worked so hard for gave Debbie a thrill. She'd always been someone who liked her independence, and now that she had a place of her own, she loved keeping her cozy living room, kitchen, and bedroom absolutely spotless. And with no one to look over her shoulder, she could eat as many mayonnaise sandwiches, a personal favorite of hers, as often as she wanted to. Even the things Debbie didn't have turned out to be an advantage. As Peggy pointed out, the fact that Debbie did not have her own washer and dryer was actually a blessing. It meant that Debbie made regular trips to her mom's house to do her laundry, which is exactly where Debbie had been just 2 evenings earlier, listening to the tumble of the dryer while she curled up on the bed next to her mom, which is where Debbie wound up falling asleep and spending that night. Peggy, whose motherly instincts were always on high alert, still couldn't help but worry about her daughter's safety in her new apartment. But Debbie had always said, "Mom, as long as I have my teeth and nails to fight with, no one is going to hurt me." Debbie's thoughts were suddenly pulled back to the present when one of her high school acquaintances stopped by the table and asked her to dance. Debbie had always had her share of boyfriends, but she'd never been known for sleeping around. In fact, her closest girlfriends knew that Debbie was very modest and shy when it came to letting anyone see her undressed. But this was someone Debbie had known for a long time that was asking her to dance, and even though she was tired, she pushed herself up from her chair and headed out to the dance floor. But by the time Debbie had come back and ordered another beer, she was already glancing at her watch, just waiting for the night to end so she could go back home. That moment came a little sooner than she expected when her boss started closing the Coach Light early at around 12:30 a.m. Gina immediately invited everyone at their table back to her apartment for one more drink, but Debbie smiled and shook her head. No, Debbie was going to head straight home to her apartment. She promised Gina that if she changed her mind, she'd give her a call. As customers made their way back to their cars, the bouncer made sure that Debbie was not walking out of the nightclub on her own. And after having a brief conversation through her car window with another Coach Light regular, Debbie rolled up her car window, turned on the car engine, and drove out of the Coach Light parking lot towards her new home. At 2:30 a.m. on the morning of December 8th, 2 hours after the Coach Light closed its doors and turned off the lights, Gina heard the ring of her telephone cut through the noise of the people talking and laughing over drinks at her apartment. When she answered her phone, she was surprised to hear Debbie's voice on the other end. She was even more surprised by what Debbie was asking Gina to do. According to Debbie, there was a visitor in Debbie's apartment who was making Debbie uncomfortable, and Debbie wanted Gina to drive over and give Debbie a ride to Gina's house. Since Debbie had her own car and could drive to Gina's house, the request made no sense to Gina, unless Debbie's visitor wasn't letting Debbie leave. Gina tried to ask Debbie who the visitor was, but their conversation was cut short by muffled noises on Debbie's end. Gina heard Debbie talking to someone, and then the sounds of what might have been a struggle over control of the phone. Gina didn't wait to hear anything else. She sensed something was wrong. Before hanging up the phone, Gina told Debbie that she would be there as soon as she could. But before Gina even made it out the door, her phone rang again, and again the caller was Debbie. But now Debbie sounded much calmer and told Gina not to come get Debbie after all and that everything was actually okay. Debbie did ask Gina to please give Debbie a call later that morning to make sure Debbie was awake. After hanging up the phone a second time, Gina's first impulse was to ignore Debbie's second call and just still drive over to her apartment to make sure she was okay. But by the time Gina had made it out to her car, she was already having second thoughts. Even though it seemed unlikely, if Debbie did have a man over for the night, Gina didn't want to barge in on them. And Debbie had seemed very emphatic on that second call, telling Gina not to come over. So even though Gina had almost reached her car, she slowed down and then reversed course. A few minutes later, she was back inside of her own apartment, where her friends that had come over were now starting to gather their coats and leave. When Gina woke up later that morning, she completely forgot to call Debbie and check in with her. At 11:20 a.m. on December 8th, that same morning, Donna Johnson headed up the narrow wooden stairway to Debbie's apartment on East 8th Street. An old high school friend of Debbie's, Donna now lived an hour away in Shawnee, but she was back in Ada for the day to visit her parents and to catch up with old friends like Debbie. But just as Donna reached the tiny landing outside of Debbie's front door and had already raised her hand to knock, she felt bits of broken glass grinding under her shoe. And at the same time, Donna registered the fact that the little window in Debbie's door was broken. Even as Donna did reach up and start knocking on the door, she heard the faint sound of a radio playing inside of Debbie's apartment. When there was no answer to her second knock on the door, Donna checked the doorknob and realized that the door was unlocked. As soon as Donna stepped inside, she knew something was terribly wrong. The living room in front of her was a mess. The sofa cushions were scattered on the floor, and strewn across the linoleum in the kitchen off to her side, Donna saw a woman's blouse and a pair of jeans. Even as Donna started to step past the mess towards Debbie's bedroom, she took in the sight of words scrawled in red on the living room walls and on the small white table in the kitchen. But nothing could have prepared Donna for what she saw next. Lying face down on the floor of the bedroom on the far side of the bed, nude except for one sock, lay Debbie's bloody and lifeless body. The bed had been shoved away from the wall, and all the covers were pulled off of it. On Debbie's back, Donna saw more words written in red liquid. Stumbling backwards in horror, Donna suddenly realized that whoever had done this to Debbie might still be hidden inside of the apartment, and a minute later, Donna was clattering back down the stairs outside. Hopping into her car, Donna drove to the nearest payphone to call Debbie's mother, Peggy, who in turn quickly called her ex-husband, Charlie. Charlie arrived at his daughter's apartment ahead of the police and medical personnel. In Debbie's bedroom, Charlie fell to his knees next to his daughter's body. Charlie called Debbie's name twice before gently lifting one of his daughter's shoulders so he could look at her face. A bloody washcloth was stuffed deep into Debbie's mouth. Minutes later, the street in front of Debbie's apartment was lined with police cars, a wailing ambulance, and law enforcement. Stepping into Debbie's apartment bedroom, Ada police detective Dennis Smith took one look at Debbie's body and knew that he had a brutal rape and homicide on his hands. As the 17-year veteran of the Ada Police Department took in the horrific details of how Debbie had died, he also knew that this case felt intensely personal. In addition to knowing Debbie's parents, Charlie and Peggy, Detective Smith's own daughter was good friends with Debbie's younger sister. Doing his best to keep his emotions under control, the 39-year-old detective immediately ordered officers to seal off the immediate area around the apartment from the growing crowd of neighbors and bystanders. After clearing the inside of the apartment, Detective Smith did not waste any time. He sent police officers out to knock on doors and interview neighbors to see if anyone saw or heard anything unusual during the night and early morning hours. He also wanted a list of Debbie's friends, boyfriends, coworkers, family members, and possible enemies. Police would soon find out from Debbie's friend Gina about the 2 phone calls Debbie had made between 2:30 and 3 a.m. that morning, and based on that testimony, they would quickly narrow the time of the murder to some time between 2:30 a.m. and 11:40 a.m. when Donna had discovered Debbie's body. With that information in hand, Detective Smith was especially interested in knowing exactly who saw or interacted with Debbie on the night of December 8th and into the early morning hours of December 9th at the coach light. Since that could include a list of dozens of people, Detective Smith also pushed out a general request for the male patrons of the coach light the night before, as well as any male acquaintances of Debbie's, to come to the police station and voluntarily submit hair, pubic hair, and saliva samples. Satisfied that the investigation was now underway, Detective Smith stepped back and tried to make sense of the crime scene, in which all 3 rooms of Debbie's apartment appeared to have been upended by a struggle between Debbie and her attacker. In fact, starting with the shattered front door window and ending with the ripped and torn trail of clothing and furniture, the apartment was so trashed that Detective Smith realized that this homicide might be the work of more than one perpetrator. That suspicion grew stronger as the detective looked at the 4 messages that the killer or killers had left behind. Written in nail polish on the wall of the den was the sentence, "Jim Smith will die next." On Debbie's back, written in what would turn out to be ketchup, Detective Smith read the name Duke Graham. Once Debbie's body was turned over, the detective would see a single word written in red fingernail polish on Debbie's chest, "Die." And on the kitchen table, written in ketchup again, was a message that referred explicitly to 2 killers. "Don't look for us, or else." The names Jim Smith and Duke Graham were both familiar to Ada police. Duke was a local nightclub owner, and Jim was a local small-time criminal that Duke had once driven out of his bar with a shotgun. As Detective Smith, no relation to Jim Smith, completed his examination of Debbie's apartment, he sent officers to find out where both those men were and bring them in for questioning. Then, the detective watched for a few minutes as crime scene techs went about their work inside the apartment, dusting for fingerprints and photographing and collecting possible evidence. That evidence included any strands of human hair, the murder weapon, and the removal of a 4x4-inch square of sheetrock from the bedroom wall that contained a single bloody handprint. The next day, Thursday, December 9th, at 3 p.m., the autopsy of Debbie's body would confirm that she had been raped before she died. Detective Smith was joined at that autopsy by agents from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation who had offered their help and support to local law enforcement. The men watched as the medical examiner collected samples of hair from Debbie's body, as well as scrapings from under Debbie's fingernails, clippings from which were also carefully entered and tagged as evidence. By this point, more than a dozen men had already come forward to the police station to deliver their DNA samples to the police. And it was clear to Detective Smith in interacting with these guys that he was not the only person in Ada who was personally upset by Debbie's murder. One of the first people that police interviewed was a guy named Glenn Gore, who was one of Debbie's old high school classmates who had been with her at the coach light before she was killed. And he, like the other friends who had been with Debbie that night, was very shaken up and just could not understand who would want to harm Debbie. And over the next few days, police would hear testimony that sounded a lot like Glenn's. No one seemed to have any idea who would want to harm Debbie. And within days of the murder, police had confirmed that neither Graham Duke or Jim Smith could have been involved in the killing. Graham had an ironclad alibi, and Jim was locked up in state prison. By the morning of Debbie's funeral, on Saturday, December 11th, 3 days after her murder, townspeople's fear and frustration only got more intense as mourners filed past Debbie's open casket, because all the makeup in the world could not disguise the terrible injuries to the young woman's swollen and badly beaten face, and whoever had done that was still out walking the streets. Meanwhile, investigators were frustrated by the fact that they had to wait for results from the state's crime lab. Investigators knew that a key piece of physical evidence in the case was the bloody handprint that had been collected from the wall of Debbie's apartment. If that print did not belong to Debbie, it had to belong to someone else who was in the room when Debbie was killed, and that person would most likely be Debbie's murderer. But in the face of growing public pressure to solve a case that was quickly showing signs of getting cold, Detective Smith and Ada's prosecuting attorney, Bill Peterson, decided they could not wait until the Oklahoma State Crime Lab ID'd that print. Instead, in early March of 1983, 3 months after Debbie's death, investigators zeroed in on 2 brand new suspects. This new direction in the investigation was based on unsubstantiated rumors about the murder that were circulating in the local county jail. The first and primary suspect was 30-year-old Ron Williamson, a former minor league baseball player who was one of Ada's well-known hellraisers and heavy drinkers. Ron, who lived not far from Debbie's garage apartment, was fingered as a possible suspect by his county jail cellmate when Ron was locked up on a drunk driving conviction. According to his cellmate, when news of Debbie's murder spread through the inmate population, Ron, who was also known to have serious mental health issues, became very upset. The second suspect, a 23-year-old man named Dennis Fritz, who was new to Ada but who had been seen in Ron's company at some local bars, was a person of interest, mostly because police believed the murder had been committed by two men, and Dennis was one of Ron's few friends. Both men were interviewed repeatedly by police, and both denied any involvement in Debbie's murder. They also submitted fingerprints and DNA to police. Eventually, after hours of aggressive questioning from investigators, Dennis was told he failed a lie detector test, and Ron was told that the results of the lie detector test he had agreed to take were inconclusive. But even after the Oklahoma State Crime Lab reported back to Ada police on March 28, 1983, that the bloody handprint on the wall of Debbie's bedroom did not match prints belonging to Debbie, Dennis, or Ron, Ada law enforcement did just the opposite of backing off that avenue of investigation. Instead, they began to focus exclusively on Ron and Dennis. Neither man had been seen on the night of the murder at the Coach Light, but without any other suspects in the case, Ada investigators doubled down on building a circumstantial case against the men. The case was based mostly on Ron's history and reputation in Ada as unpredictable, occasionally violent, and at times mentally unstable, as well as allegations from more jailhouse informants saying that Ron had had a dream about Debbie's murder. The police continued to focus on Dennis based on their conviction that the crime had been committed by more than one person. In December of 1983, Detective Smith's case against Ron was suddenly strengthened when a customer who had been at the Coach Light on the night before Debbie's murder came forward and told police they had seen Ron at the nightclub that night, just hours before Debbie would be killed. But it wouldn't be until May 1st, 1986, 4.5 years after Debbie's murder, that Ada police got the information they felt they needed to clear the way for an arrest and conviction in the homicide case that had slowly poisoned the once safe and tight-knit little town of Ada, Oklahoma. That was when Ada's district attorney, Bill Peterson, persuaded Debbie's mother, Peggy Stillwell, to allow police to dig up Debbie's body and re-examine her handprint to see if maybe it did match the bloody print that police found on her wall. If investigators could somehow prove that the bloody print on Debbie's bedroom wall actually did belong to Debbie, then police would no longer have to find a suspect whose print matched that one on the wall. And sure enough, after taking prints from the hand of a 4-year-old corpse, the same agent who had earlier declared that the print on the wall did not match Debbie's prints now revised his report to say that it was inconclusive whose print was on the wall. That shadow of a doubt was all police needed. Combined with a hair analysis showing that some of the head hairs found at Debbie's apartment bore a microscopic resemblance to samples provided by Ron and Dennis, Detective Smith and District Attorney Bill Peterson were sure they had solved the case. 1 week later, on May 8, 1986, Ron Williamson and Dennis Fritz were arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Debbie Carter. For Debbie's family and many other residents of Ada, Ron's arrest came as a relief. Ever since he was first questioned by police back in early 1983, Ron's mental health had deteriorated. His mood swings were more extreme, his behavior had become even more erratic and at times violent. And he had spent all 4 of those years since Debbie's murder in and out of jail on charges ranging from forging a check worth $300 to violating parole to public intoxication. Meanwhile, the long wait for justice had just about destroyed Debbie's mother, Peggy, who had begun to drink heavily and spend hours and hours sitting near her oldest daughter's grave in nearby Rosedale Cemetery. And so, in April of 1988, both Ron and Dennis were convicted in separate trials of Debbie's murder, and the town of Ada breathed a collective sigh of relief. Dennis was sentenced to life in prison, and Ron was sentenced to death. The actual date of Ron's execution was set for September 27, 1994. Ron and his court-appointed attorney would have 6 years to file appeals. Finally, after more than 6 years, Debbie's family could begin to heal, and Debbie, now buried for a second time, could finally be left in peace. As the spring of 1988 blossomed in Ada, the town of 15,000 residents could sleep easier knowing that Debbie's killers were safely behind bars. But all that would change 6 years later on September 22, 1994. Exactly 5 days before Ron Williamson was scheduled to die by lethal injection, a federal appeals judge shocked Ada law enforcement by ordering a stay of execution. The ruling was based on an appeal by Ron's lawyer outlining violations of Ron's constitutional rights during his 1987 trial. But even though that same judge would eventually grant Ron's request for a new trial, the tip that wound up cracking the case of Debbie Carter's rape and murder wide open would have nothing to do with legal arguments about police work. In early 1999, while Dennis was still serving a life sentence and Ron was still in prison awaiting his new trial, Ada's district attorney, Bill Peterson, received a phone call with news so stunning it would place Ada at ground zero of a national media blitz that would reverberate throughout the town and the Oklahoma judicial system for decades to come. Based on that new information and follow-up work by local investigators and agents from the Oklahoma State Department of Investigation, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Debbie Carter on the night of December 7th and in the early morning hours of Wednesday, December 8th, 1982. It was a slow night at the Coachlight nightclub, and 21-year-old part-time waitress Debbie Carter was grateful that her boss had let her go off the clock. Now she looked around the table at her group of friends, which included Gina, a Coachlight regular who had asked Debbie to take off her work apron and join them for a couple of beers. On her way over to Gina's table an hour earlier, Debbie had done her usual inventory of Coachlight customers. She'd waitressed at enough bars that it was second nature now to read the room for any signs of trouble from difficult or rowdy patrons. Town bad boy Ron Williamson was not there, and it had been weeks since his friend, Dennis Fritz, had stopped by. Ron was 8 years older than Debbie was, and all she really knew about him and his friend was that they liked to play guitar and that Ron had once been a very popular and promising kid who went on to play minor league baseball for the New York Yankees before an injury had ended his career. Debbie was glad Ron wasn't at the Coachlight. You serve him a couple of drinks and he could get loud and aggressive, and she'd heard that at least one woman back in 1978 had accused him of rape, although Debbie had also heard that those charges were eventually dismissed. But there was still one person at the Coachlight that night that Debbie wished wasn't there. She'd felt his eyes following her when she crossed the room serving drinks, and again when she had walked over to Gina's table. He'd even come over and asked Debbie to dance. She had agreed, they'd gone to school together and they had known each other for years, but when he'd gotten so persistent out there on the dance floor, pressing in way too close to her, she'd actually had to push him away and leave him standing out there alone. When the Coachlight closed early at 12:20 a.m., and Debbie had declined Gina's offer to go to Gina's place for one more drink, there her creepy dance partner was again. This time, he was insisting on walking her to her car out in the parking lot. Debbie had told Mike, the bouncer that night, that this was one of her high school classmates who actually kind of scared her. And when this classmate stood outside of her car and tried to talk to her through her car window, Debbie was glad to see Mike kind of slow down on his way to his own car to make sure Debbie was okay. Seeing her chance, Debbie waved at Mike and then rolled up her car window, turned on her car engine, and drove out of the parking lot, once again leaving her old high school classmate, her creepy dance partner, standing there all alone. Getting dumped like that did not sit well with Debbie's killer, but he knew where Debbie lived, and he'd made up his mind to drop by her place later that night. A few hours later, Debbie's killer was walking the last few blocks of the way to Debbie's new apartment on East 8th Street. He was relieved to see a light on in the rooms above the garage, and a few minutes later, he had walked up the set of wooden stairs to the small landing outside of Debbie's front door. When Debbie's face appeared in the small glass window, her killer took a step back and put on his most reassuring smile. He could see Debbie did not look happy to see him, but he made the most of her few seconds of hesitation, calling to her through the closed door that he just wanted to say hello. It was a cold night, please just let him inside for a few minutes. And just as he had hoped, Debbie did exactly that. Except that Debbie's killer did not leave after a few minutes. And when Debbie picked up the phone and called Gina and asked Gina to drive over and get Debbie and take her to Gina's house, it was all Debbie's killer could do. First, to interrupt the conversation before Debbie gave Gina his name, and then to persuade Debbie to call Gina back and say that everything with Debbie was okay after all. But the whole episode with the phone and Debbie's earlier refusal to have sex with him, which is what he wanted and what he'd come there for, made Debbie's killer very angry. Instead of leaving, which is what he'd just promised Debbie he would do, he waited until Debbie had turned away from him to show him to the door before grabbing her from behind and spinning her back around to face him. When the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Debbie's body 2 days later, at 3 p.m. on the afternoon of December 9th, the catalog of wounds and injuries she had suffered, all inflicted before her actual death, told the story of the violent struggle between Debbie and her killer in the early morning hours of December 8th. Over the course of the assault, Debbie would be beaten, stripped, and raped. In trying to fight off her attacker, Debbie would sustain bruises, scrapes, and small cuts on her arms, hands, face, under her chin, and on the back of her head, along with bruises and bite marks inside her mouth and on her tongue. At some point, Debbie's attacker would shove a bloody washcloth down her throat, and there were traces of shampoo as well as ketchup left on her back and buttocks. In addition to the electrical cord that Debbie's father would see wrapped around his daughter's neck, Charlie would also see the beautiful leather belt that Debbie's mother had given Debbie for her 21st birthday, a belt that had now been used to strangle their oldest daughter. The medical examiner would confirm asphyxiation, lack of oxygen, was the ultimate cause of Debbie's death. After the killer had squeezed the last breath of air out of his victim, he sat straddling Debbie's body for a few moments so he could catch his breath. Then he pushed himself back onto his feet and collected and adjusted his clothing before turning his attention to Debbie's apartment. According to an expert in crime scene reconstruction, Debbie's killer would have spent a substantial amount of time staging the crime scene to make it look like the attack had been the work of more than one person. And Debbie's killer would also use the messages he wrote on Debbie's back and chest, as well as on the walls and kitchen table in her apartment, to divert police attention to two other men, Duke Graham and Jim Smith, who were already known to Ada law enforcement. Once he was satisfied with his work, Debbie's killer took a final look around, then stepped to the door of Debbie's ruined apartment. Before leaving, he carefully broke the glass window in the center of the door, so there were bits of glass both inside the apartment as well as outside on the landing. Pulling the unlocked door closed behind him, the killer walked down the wooden stairway out into the cold Oklahoma night air. Later that day, Debbie's killer would go to the Ada police station along with the dozens of other men in town, and he would tell police that he did see Debbie the night before at the coach light, but he had no idea what happened to her. And unlike the 44 other men who would come to the Ada police station over the next days and hours and weeks, Debbie's killer managed to go to the police station but slip away without giving his fingerprints and without submitting samples of his saliva and hair. He would also change his statement 1 year later and tell police that on the night of December 7th, he had seen Ron Williamson at the coach light, and that when the killer had walked Debbie out to her car just after the coach light closed at 12:30 a.m. on December 8th, Debbie had confided to him that she was afraid of Ron. Later still, at Ron's trial in 1988, Debbie's killer would be the star witness whose testimony to that effect would help put both Ron and Dennis behind bars, Ron facing the death penalty and Dennis facing life in prison. It wouldn't be until April of 1999, 11 years after Ron and Dennis were convicted, that advances in forensic science and the real killer's own criminal history would finally catch up with him. Because even as Ron Williamson was filing the legal appeals that would result in a stay of execution just 5 days before he was scheduled to die and the granting of a new trial, Dennis Fritz had been working tirelessly to get a new analysis done of all the DNA evidence that had been collected at the scene of Debbie's murder back in 1982. And by early 1999, Dennis was finally successful. And on January 26th and 27th, new tests conducted by Laboratory Corporation of America showed that none of the semen samples collected at the crime scene and from Debbie's body matched samples given by Ron and Dennis. Later, tests on the 17 hair samples that had also been collected at the crime scene, including one strand with a hair follicle still attached, also excluded Ron and Dennis as Debbie's killer. Meanwhile, even though Debbie's killer had literally gotten away with murder on December 8, 1982, by 1987, he was behind bars serving a 40-year sentence for robbery, aggravated assault, and kidnapping. And in 1995, the state of Oklahoma began taking blood samples from every one of its prison inmates, analyzing DNA from those samples, and entering the DNA results in a brand new DNA bank. With recent advances in forensic science, law enforcement would run DNA evidence collected from crime scenes through that DNA databank to see if any inmates were connected to unsolved crimes. And in 1999, not only would the Laboratory Corporation of America run DNA tests that would clear Ron and Dennis of any involvement in Debbie's murder, they also ran tests against the Oklahoma Prison DNA Databank that would identify Debbie's real killer. When Ada law enforcement were informed about the results of those tests, not only would Ron and Dennis be set free, but District Attorney Bill Peterson would have to prepare for a new murder trial and build a case against his own former star witness who had helped wrongfully convict Ron and Dennis 11 years earlier. But before police could charge their new suspect in the 1982 murder of Debbie Carter, this case took one more unbelievable twist. Around noon on the day that Ron and Dennis finally walked out of prison as free men and drew their first breath of cool and fresh Oklahoma spring air, Debbie's killer quietly slipped away from his prison work detail in the town of Purcell, 50 miles north of Ada. Pulling off his prison work shirt, Debbie's old school classmate, Glenn Gore, the same Glenn Gore who had been the first to go to Ada police and give them his testimony and say, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe this happened to Debbie, who would do this to her?" That Glenn Gore melted into the nearby woods close to the ditch he had been cleaning, and when police arrived at the Lexington prison where he was serving his 40-year sentence, they found that Glenn had escaped. 6 days later, Glenn turned himself in on condition that his return to prison would not be handled by Ada law enforcement. In the days and weeks that followed the release of Ron and Dennis, Detective Smith and District Attorney Bill Peterson would be completely discredited in the local, state, and national press for their mishandling of Debbie's murder investigation. It would take 2 trials, but on June 24, 2006, 45-year-old Glenn Gore would be convicted of first-degree murder in the 1982 death of then 21-year-old Deborah Carter, and he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ron Williamson never recovered from his ordeal in prison and on death row. Although he and Dennis both received an undisclosed amount of money in damages for their wrongful conviction, Ron's mental and physical health just kept getting worse. After giving most of his money away, Ron died in a nursing home in December 2004. He was only 51 years old. Dennis Fritz would return to Kansas City, where he would go back to teaching school and living with his daughter, but in 2016, he would suffer a debilitating head injury in a car accident. Detective Dennis Smith would die of a sudden, unexpected heart attack in June of 2006, just weeks after being called to testify in Glenn Gore's murder trial. In 2014, Debbie's mother, Peggy Stillwell, would write a letter to Glenn Gore begging him to tell her why he killed her daughter. Unfortunately, Glenn never wrote back. Thanks to author John Grisham, whose 2006 nonfiction account of the story, The Innocent Man, was an invaluable source of information in creating this episode. Please see our source list for links to other related material.
Rolls softly over emerald dances on forgotten dreams. Footsteps echo in the silent veil, leading hearts beyond the mortal trail. There's a quiet little tremble every time you look my way, like the world begins to soften into colors I can't quite explain. You speak in gentle rhythms that my heartbeat learns to trace, and suddenly the chaos falls in line around your face. I don't know how you pull me in so effortlessly, but every breath you take rewrites my gravity.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the 5-star review button's lip balm with superglue. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on all platforms. But on November 1st of this year, 2022, this podcast will become exclusive to Amazon Music. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin.